very soon open the floor for those of you who want to come on the speakers list. But while you sign on the speakers list, I can have a couple of follow-ups to our excellent panel. And Mr. Weber, if I start with you, if you were to elaborate a little bit on how you see how prepared are the US and the West today for a coming terrorist, or how to prevent a terrorist attack, what would be your view?
Well, we've done some things. I mentioned our strategic national stockpile of vaccines and antibiotics. We've had national level exercises. We have robust research and development programs for developing new sensors and diagnostics for early detection, and new drugs, new therapeutics, and vaccines. So for a few diseases where we have countermeasures today, I think we're in better shape. And I mentioned smallpox and anthrax as two examples of that. But having been involved in the Ebola crisis, clearly the world is not sufficiently prepared to deal with a large epidemic or pandemic. And it also showed that we're only as safe and protected as the weakest link around the world. So that's why I'm a huge supporter of the global health security agenda, and Norway is a big player in that effort to put in place the basic public health infrastructure for early detection so epidemics can be contained before they spread around the world. In a sense, though, Ebola was a wake-up call, and I already feel that we're falling asleep again. So we go between panic and neglect, and it really is in peacetime that we have to make these investments. There's no political constituency, really, for making these investments. It's a good government thing. The public expects us to be prepared, but they don't really demand it. And because these events are rare, it's only when something happens that exposes our lack of preparedness that then publics lose confidence in their governments. So it takes leadership, it takes champions on both sides, and there's more we can do.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I'm sure that very often you have, or you can comment on it, do you know how many terrorist attacks that actually are prevented in the US that the public never knows, or in the Western world as such? I mean, many of us, for good reasons, wouldn't know all of these things.
Yeah, I think we've had a good record over 15 years of preventing terrorist attacks in the United States. The last year has been rough. I mean, Europe really has become the front lines for this fight against terrorism, but we have had some homegrown, inspired attacks in the United States. The availability of guns is a big vulnerability in my country. But I will take issue with one remark that Anders had about the likelihood. I do think that the likelihood of biological terrorism, which we have experienced, by the way, is significantly higher than nuclear weapons terrorism, not radiological terrorism, but nuclear weapons terrorism.
Right. Anders, you said you were working on the law that will be presented on Wednesday. Obviously, you can't say so much for the moment what will be the substance, but in your view, how prepared is Norway? What is your view of how prepared we are as a society for maybe a next terrorist attack?
We are not as prepared as we should be.
Can we ever be that?
I problematized that so in my remarks. So I'd say that there is a gap between what is reasonably achievable and what we actually do. A lot of the time the resources do not find one another, and I am concerned about the cooperation between the police and the military in Norway. After the 22nd of July attacks, we had a period of time where working together was, it was a very important code of conduct that really brought these entities together. Now I'm fearful. This report was launched 9 days ago. It concerns bistandsanmodning, the procedures for how the military can aid the police in times of crisis, and particularly when it comes to terrorism. And the police and the military did not agree. That's a bad sign. The Gemini exercise, which is a yearly exercise, concerns maritime counterterrorism at offshore installations. It is about working together, and this year the police and military hold separate exercises on how to cooperate better together, which is ridiculous. I think the 5 years were up in July 2016, and I think the political leadership need to force this issue. And there are 3 pillars. There's the police, there's the military, and then it's the civilian sector. And they all need to pull in the same direction if we are going to constantly improve our preparedness for the next terrorist attack. Because we are at risk. We know that from the 22nd of July attacks, and we need to draw out in time the effect on counterterrorism that it had. We can't let our guard down, and the developments we see this year, up until 2016, I thought people were coming more together. Up until this year, we need to reinvigorate those efforts significantly.
Thomas Hegghammer, same question to you, basically. You follow especially the jihadi movements around Europe. How do you think, how well prepared are European societies, and Norway in particular, for a terrorist attack?
Well, my work and my colleagues' work has been mainly on the kind of the actors and their capabilities and intentions. I think there are other people in this room who can...
But to rephrase it though, how serious do you think the risks is for another terrorist attack?
Of any kind, or
yeah, sure.
In Norway or
Europe, Norway, I mean...
Well, let me say what many people know, which is that over the past 2 years, there's been a significant increase in the number of plots. Plots is the relevant metric. People keep counting executed attack, but you have to count plots, because most plots are averted, and the foiling often happens by coincidence and things like that. So we have to count plots, and the number of plots have increased. The proportion of plots that come to execution has increased significantly, which suggests that the services are struggling. And other evidence suggests too that our intelligence services are stretched thin. And one indication, for example, was the time it took to find Salah Abdeslam after the Paris attacks and round up the Belgium cells. Never in European post 9/11 history has a terrorist network or a jihadi network been allowed to strike hard twice. Previously, we always found the guys and kind of rooted out the network before they could strike again. That didn't happen this time around. All these things suggest that services are stretched. The number of foreign fighters has, as you know, shot through the roof, although it's been declining in the past year. So, yeah, I mean, the likelihood of any attacks in Europe is very, very high. I mean, I think that that we'll see something. There will be plots in the next 3 months. I'm certain of. You can never predict whether they will come to execution or exactly where it will happen.
Right. I have noticed two people wanting to come on the speakers list. First, Jan Baltersen, and also noticed the young lady there. So there's also room for other people, and also Jan.
Hello, my name is Jorn Baltersen, and my question is regarding something closely related to preparedness, namely blowback, something that has been addressed by former Congressman Ron Paul, and I believe also it's been addressed by the 9/11 Commission. It's about us unnecessarily provoking terrorism, and of course this is not the whole picture, but it's an important part of the picture. Are we doing enough to avoid terrorist attacks by not unnecessarily provoking them? Thank you.
Well, a highly political question. I can start with you, Mr. Weber. What do you think?
Well, I mean, there is the fact that 15 years ago there were fewer active terrorists than there are today. So we need to reflect on that. And are there things that we've done to maybe not provoke it, but to allow the conditions for it to increase? And if any of you are paying attention to our political circus, I think some of the comments that Donald Trump has made during his campaign are really a gift to the jihadi extremist groups, and I mean that just builds them up in a very dangerous way.
Right. Anders?
In my remarks, I highlighted avoiding repressive counterterrorism policies, and there are certainly pitfalls that may expose you unnecessarily to terrorism. But one of the things that will make terrorism more likely to strike you is if you go on the offense internationally and try to fight it. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong to participate in international coalitions to root terrorism out of Afghanistan or of Syria and Iraq. We must never degenerate to a level where we let the terrorists' preferences on how we fight them dictate our policy. So that's the pitfall on the other side, in my opinion, to your question. Fighting terrorism is incredibly unpopular among terrorists, and rightly so. And a lot of the time you'll see terrorists striking us for who we are, more than any policy that we have adopted, in my opinion. Terrorism exists and it will continue to exist, and we have to fight it in as prudent a manner as we can. There's a balance here between being overly provocative and actually conceding policy options to the preferences of terrorists, which I'm very, very skeptical about.
Right. Thomas Hegghammer, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I mean, what are the motivations for, terrorists, especially jihadi terrorists? Is there something in that we have created the room for them to do their terrorist attacks?
Well, I find this question is impossible to debate at this sort of macro level. Obviously, counter-terrorism measures can backfire by provoking, by producing more terrorists than you take out. Or equally, it's equally absurd to suggest that the whole phenomenon is our own fault, that it is sort of blaming the victim. So I think the only fruitful way to discuss this, I think, is by looking at specific policies, specific measures that we're taking. And there's a whole range. The war on terror, or the Western kind of measures against terrorism, include thousands of measures. and perhaps a smaller number of kind of broader strategies. And we have to discuss each of them separately, I think, to get a good understanding of this. But I will say this, which is that, and I don't think people reflect on this enough, that Western liberal democracies spend enormous sums of money to avoid being overly repressive. There are many other countries in the world that would respond to similar types of threats and attacks by simpler and more brutal ways. Ways of dealing with it. So, for example, someone is in a sort of semi-radical network. We put a number of highly paid intelligence analysts on them. Well, you put a team of 20, 25 people, which is what you need to follow someone 24/7. The sums of money we spend on surveillance, things like this, are insane compared to the cost of simply arresting that person, throwing him in jail, which is what happens in many other countries with suspected terrorists.
Right.
So let's not bear that in. Let's not forget about this perspective about that.
Right. Next speaker is, you will get the mic from Mats. I also noticed Iyad and the gentleman sitting there.
Hi, my name is Ruth Sham, from Seattle, originally. You talked in the beginning about the different levels of protection, including the individual in society. And could you mention what should the individual do in the Norwegian society to prepare or protect or prevent? And the second completely concrete, do you believe that Norwegian schools should have drills for preparation today or yesterday to prevent and protect? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with you, Anders.
Thank you. At the individual level, you have to be careful about sort of assigning and telling people how to react. I believe that avoiding fear is incredibly important. And school exercises, I do believe we are starting to see them as regards school shootings or hostage situations. We're starting to see some schools looking in that direction. I don't know if that's really necessary. I'm not going to say that I'm against it, but sometimes getting you more prepared can get you more scared in the process, and then it sort of it doesn't make that much sense. At the individual level, I do believe that people have to have a knowledge-based approach to risk, and that sounds very, very abstract. But terrorism exists. It may hit our society. It is at the same time very unlikely to hit just you. But that does not mean that we don't have to take counterterrorism measures, which is the absurd conclusion some people reach, saying, yeah, well, people die in their bathtubs more frequently than from terrorist attacks, so why are we wasting all this money that Thomas talked about? But the probability of just you being struck by terrorism doesn't mean that it's okay that someone else is struck by terrorism. And terrorist attacks are not accidents. And we have to remember at the bottom line here is the societal contract between government and people. We don't carry arms everywhere. A few too many in your country, I'm afraid, but you already addressed that. But we leave to the police to keep order and for the military to keep foreign threats out, and then we don't arm ourselves and go about security business in our daily lives. And if the state doesn't seem interested and proactive in thwarting attacks from people who actually want to hurt us, these are not accidents. We have to expect that from government. So the best advice to sum up this is the British old expression: keep calm and carry on. That's the remedy.
Follow up, Andy Weber. Isn't there a risk that if you focus too much on it, you can create what kind of hysteria, or that you can also have a blowback in terms of preparing too much and creating a kind of fear within society? How do you balance these things?
Yeah, it's important to balance, and don't want to scare people. One practical thing we can do to prevent specifically WMD terrorism is to pay more attention to the supply side. The people who have knowledge, expertise, access to materials. And in the case of biological terrorism, these are veterinarians, microbiologists, nuclear facilities, they're aware of security, but I've been to so many biological laboratories, animal health laboratories around the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia, where the thought that they could possibly be vulnerable to exploitation by terrorist groups would never even occur to them. So we need to do a better job of mapping the supply side of this equation, the legitimate people who have dual use knowledge and access that could be exploited or misused. And I think that can go a long way to preventing WMD terrorism specifically.
Question from Iyad.
Yes, Iyad al-Baghdadi. I have a question for each member of the panel, and I'll start with you, Andy. It seems to me that there is the short-term focus. I mean, I was actually a little surprised that you would consider the way in which state WMDs were dealt with was a success. It seems to me at least plausible that the way in which that threat was handled actually gave us the problem we have today. It actually increased proliferation in a sense that states are rational actors, but on the other hand, we have ISIS, which is not a rational actor, it's more of an apocalyptic actor. So it seems to me that the way that Iraq's WMDs and later Syria's WMDs were dealt with is what gave us the situation today. In an answer to a previous question, you said that yes, there were mistakes made and we need to learn the lessons. So the question is, what are the practical implications of these lessons? I mean, what policy recommendations would you make in response to these? Anders, I have a question about, or rather a comment about, you mentioned the danger of fear politics and what that would do to a society, because when we're talking about a strong society, we're talking about the opposite of that. Whose raiment is that? Whose job is that? I know this is not the job of counter-terrorists, probably of politicians, but whose job is that? And are we doing a good job? Thomas, two questions. First is a practical question. After 2004, or maybe from 2004 onwards, after the Iraqi war, we see a spike in attacks in the West. And then after 2014, 10 years later, we see another spike. You mentioned that we're only seeing the visible end, which is successful attacks. We don't see all the plots that are actually foiled before they happen. Is there also an increase in the number of plots after 2004 and after 2014? And final question, we're not talking about radicalization. It seems to me that if there is a really motivated person, it doesn't seem to be possible to completely eliminate the potential for an attack, for a very costly attack. Again, whose raiment is that? If we're talking about radicalization and really understanding what would drive someone to do something like that. Thank you.
Excellent questions. Well, we can start with you, Thomas. You had two concrete questions I'd like to address.
Yeah, so yes, there is an Iraq effect, increase in the number of plots in the years after 2003. It goes down a little bit again and then it starts climbing. Yes, there was certainly an even larger increase after 2014. There is no question that Western military interventions in the Middle East cause, at least in the short term, a response in the form of attacks. And you can go further back in time to into 80s and 90s and similar patterns. The question in those cases, of course, is it more dangerous to not intervene, and perhaps do you intervene and take the short-term kind of backlash, or do you leave it with the risk that the problem might get even worse? The second question I didn't quite. Yes.
It seems to me that we don't really understand it that well. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, we know how it happens. We know who has radicalized, but we don't really know what causes it. That's true.
Anders?
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions. When it comes to fear politics and who's responsible to counter that, I think we need to. That's a great question, and we need to return to what terrorism is and what it does. And oftentimes, terrorism seeks to drive a spike between leadership and population. They want to demonstrate that the government cannot keep you safe from harm. Through violent attacks, bringing death and carnage, they show you that they proved that they could kill up to 3,000 people in Manhattan on an ordinary day, that they could kill 77 people in Norway on a summer's day in July 2011. And when you have subsequent attacks, like you see now in the French-speaking parts of Europe, then you can get a crisis of confidence. People start to think the government isn't doing enough, and then you can go down those non-benign repressive routes. And France is at the brink, in my opinion, when it comes to that. They are going on the offensive, and as a government, you sort of have to. You can't just lean back and say, well, there's very little we can do about this. Then you are going to, then you might as well abdicate in a sense and say someone else will have to fix this problem because we quite simply can't. So I think the whole discourse in society is what drives these processes. It has to be some element of calmness and a sensible approach to risk, both at government level and at societal level in the discussions. And from that you can garner individuals that are fearful or that are calculating risk and not overly panic-like in their call for strong countermeasures to terrorism.
Andy Weber, questions about Iraq and Syria?
So I think we went about eliminating Iraq and Syria's WMD programs in the right way. In Iraq in the 1990s with UN, UNSCOM inspections and on-the-ground efforts to dismantle those programs permanently, which was successful. In Syria, having the UN and the Nobel Prize-winning Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons have an orderly inventory and destruction of Syria's chemical weapons. That was much more effective than a military strike would have been. And most recently, the Iran agreement with the intrusive, unprecedented level of inspections by the IAEA of that process. I think the strategic mistake of my lifetime was to go into Iraq the second time in the 2000s, and the way we did that and our lack of planning for the splintering of the state. We're still paying the price, and clearly the breakdown of the Syrian state and the Iraqi state is what's allowing these so-called non-state actors like Daesh to have a harbor, to grow, to take over cities and territories like Mosul and Raqqa, and so that was a mistake. And much of my career was dealt with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the chaos that left behind, and the legacy of the WMD program. So ironically, it's these weak states that present a new type of threat, and the empowerment of non-state actors, I think, is something new, and it's the biggest challenge that we're facing, and we haven't quite gotten it right yet on how to deal with that.
Let me just repeat the speakers list. We're getting fast towards 9:30. The gentleman has the mic there, and I also noticed the gentleman sitting there. I hope I haven't ignored anyone, because I'm going to close the speakers list now. Right. Yes, sir.
My name is Rolf Kevin. Syria is a breeding ground for terrorism. I'm sure you agree on that. And the West have taken much of the rat from the jihadists that have been directed to the West. Now, Mr. Putin is unleashing the Russian military in Syria. What can be the consequence of that? Will the jihadists turn their attention more to the Eastern Europe instead of the Western Europe? Can you make some comments on that? Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that the Syria question is a huge question, but in the scope of the discussion we have here, any comments on those? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the threat of WMD terrorism is increasingly worrying because of the development of an actor such as ISIL. Now you have pseudo-state guerrilla groups. They are vying for territorial control over a state that possesses chemical weapons, which Andy mentioned in his talk. And to my mind, Al-Qaeda was never even similarly close to that kind of a base, even though Al-Qaeda means the base in some respects. They didn't have that territorial control in the same manner. And we're more guests of the Taliban and all that. But what ISIL has accomplished is extraordinary, and it has been accomplished through our lack of action, I would dare say. I'm very worried about that, and I'm very worried about Putin going in and dictating the outcomes of conflict, because now it seems like Putin will do what is necessary to save Assad. And I think we can trust Putin to fight terrorists. I think he doesn't like terrorists, but I think we can also trust him in having no problem with making sure that a terror state and a war criminal like Assad is kept in place.
Mr. Weber, what's your thoughts on Syria?
I just couldn't agree more that Assad is a war criminal. He needs to be held to account, and Russia is now aiding and abetting in an absolutely horrific way with their bombing of Aleppo. And I believe Secretary Kerry commented that Russia was potentially committing war crimes at the moment. So all I can say is it's a very good thing that 1,300 tons of chemical weapons have been removed from that situation in Syria, which by all other accounts is horrible. But it could be a lot worse if those chemicals were still there.
Thomas Hegghammer, in your view, how with the situation in Syria, how could that affect terrorism in Europe? I mean, if you don't solve that problem, would it probably increase the problems we have in Europe on terrorist attacks?
Sure. Nothing increases the capability of a terrorist movement like access to a safe haven. 9/11 showed us that, and the recent wave in Europe has underlines that point. So, but there are so many other reasons to end the war in Syria, so we don't need the CT reason. Just a quick comment on the gentleman's question about whether jihadis might turn more towards Russia. Two things to say there. One is they already have. They've downed that passenger airplane, took off from Egypt. And Second, that the animosity has been high for decades against Russia in the jihadi movement. Think about it was the Soviet Union that invaded Afghanistan, that launched this whole movement. You had the Chechnya wars, which were enormously influential in mobilizing jihadis, and now the Syria war. So the Syria war now is just the latest in a long series of Russian aggressions and human rights abuses in the Muslim world, against which there's been an Islamist and jihadi response. So, and why don't we see more terrorism against Russia? Well, because of repression. Repression and absence of operative networks. So they just deal with the threat in a much harsher way than the liberal West does.
Right. Final question from the audience.
Members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Freddie. I just finished 2 years in the UK studying a master's in counterterrorism and a master's in intelligence. And during my studies, I have read so many articles, so many magazines, which I hope I will never read again, and also letters between heads of Al-Qaeda and others. In one of the letters, they actually discussed using WMDs, going into that route. The reason for them doing so is because of the media was so adamant and talking about this is the big scare, we need to protect against WMDs, and at the other side of that coin, they went on down the path of actually researching it. So I'm afraid that us talking about it today will again bring it up in the media, and they will again start reaching down that path. Because today they're mostly concerned or using the MO or modus operandi is small units, small arms, explosive vests, not so much perhaps, from my knowledge at least, with WMD. So I'm a little bit afraid of them going down that road with us talking too much about it, sort of the cry wolf. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, that would be the last question about the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's hope that's not the case. But you have your final comments, and you can also answer the question the way you like. I can start with you, Thomas Hegghammer.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, a lot of important things have been said. About the cry wolf part, then yes, there is. I mean, there's a lot to say about the media and the media's role in all of this. And there's a famous, symbiotic relationship between the media and terrorism. Problem is that it's really hard to regulate media coverage. It's not one single actor, and it's a tragedy of the commons in many ways. But you could argue, if the WMD threat is not as serious as the media would like to have it, and the media coverage is inspiring terrorists to pursue it, then that's a good thing. we're tricking them into doing that, something, following strategies or acquisition paths that are not particularly effective. That's more of a tongue-in-cheek remark, really. But I agree with the general point that there's a really problematic relationship between the media and terrorism threats.
Anders Romarheim, 1 minute. Closing arguments?
Yes, thank you. Whilst fighting terrorism, we have to continue to apply the playbook of liberal democracy. And if there is a bonus point system here at Civita, I wish to emphasize that I mentioned social contract theory from the Enlightenment age, which I'm sure will make me be able to bring this cup back home or something.
Certainly.
You are a very liberal think tank in that manner. And we have to stick to this liberal playbook. So while it's interesting, the last question raised, the interplay and the symbiosis between news media and terrorism, we can't really alter it that much. From the policy perspective, I think not discussing these problems is a bigger problem than the effects of discussing them. I don't know how often Al-Qaeda tunes into Civita's breakfast seminars.
Very often.
Very often. And And I'm not denying that those influences can be operative. But we have to discuss it, and that brings us back to one of the other main topics of today's discussions, which is preparedness. Because if the discussions on this important and very grave scenarios we have been discussing is only secluded inside government, and then something happens, then the level of preparedness and ability to relate to it in the public at the individual level will suffer from that. And that is a danger towards keeping up our good work against terrorism and sticking to the liberal democracy playbook.
Your final thoughts, Andy Weber?
Well, terrorists aren't pursuing these weapons because we're talking about them. But we do have an obligation not to give detailed recipe information. And there's a lot I didn't say today.
That's maybe a good thing.
Yeah. But I do believe that our best deterrence, and these groups, these nihilistic groups, are very hard to deter, but our best deterrent is preparedness and talking about preparedness. A lot of countries are, they keep it secret that they have a stockpile of vaccines or antibiotics. We talk about that in the United States publicly because we see that as part of our deterrence strategy. Maybe that preparedness will dissuade terrorists from pursuing particular types of WMD capabilities. And I was pleased to learn yesterday that Norway recently adopted a CBRN strategy, and I think that's something that should be talked about in the public. And I hope that it's implemented efficiently and resourced sufficiently to make sure that when something we failed to prevent happens, that we are prepared and we do have a good response.
Before we end this meeting and give a warm applause to our panelists, let me just close by saying our next event is on Thursday. It's kind of similar event. It's about privacy after Snowden. That is at the Kulturhuset at 6 o'clock on Thursday. And thank you all for coming today and contributing to this discussion. I think we've done our part today. Thank you, and thank you for coming.